The soft glow of candlelight reflected off crystal glasses as the pianist played a gentle nocturne in the corner of Lawrence, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. The air carried the subtle scent of white truffles and fresh flowers. It was the kind of place where reservations were booked months in advance, where the patrons wore their wealth as naturally as their tailored suits and designer dresses. Margaret Chun sat at table 7, her arthritic hands trembling slightly as she held her fork. She was 73 years old, though tonight she felt considerably older. Her emerald dress, the one her late husband Robert had loved, hung a bit loose on her frame. She had lost weight in the past 6 months. A lot of weight. Across from her sat her son Richard, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Valentino suit. His wife Catherine sat to his right, her blonde hair styled in a way that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly allowance. They were beautiful people, successful people, the kind of people who had inherited everything Margaret and Robert had spent their lives building. "The duck here is exceptional," Catherine said, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested Margaret should be grateful they had brought her to such a fine establishment, as if this was an act of charity rather than a dinner at a restaurant that Margaret herself had discovered 30 years ago. Margaret nodded politely and took a small bite. It was indeed exceptional. Everything at Lawrence was exceptional. But Margaret could barely taste it anymore. Nothing tasted the way it used to. Nothing felt the way it used to. She looked down at her plate and then at her hands. They were shaking more noticeably now. She clasped them together in her lap. "Mother, you should eat more," Richard said, glancing at her plate. His tone was not unkind, but it lacked warmth. "You're wasting away. People will think we're not taking care of you." There it was, that phrase. People will think. As if Margaret's well-being mattered only insofar as it reflected on them. Margaret had lived in the same mansion on Fifth Avenue for 52 years. She had raised 2 children there. She had held countless parties in those halls, charity galas that Richard and Catherine now hosted without her. 6 months ago, after a minor heart condition scare, everything had changed. Suddenly, Richard insisted she could not live alone. Suddenly, she had moved into a room in their penthouse in the Upper East Side. The same penthouse she had helped them purchase, using trust money her father had left her. It was supposed to be temporary, just until she felt stronger. But strength was becoming harder to maintain when everything was being taken from her. "I'm fine," Margaret said quietly. "Just not very hungry tonight." "You never are lately," Catherine muttered, cutting into her lamb with the precision of a surgeon. "Dr. Morrison said you need to maintain your weight. You're at risk for complications." Dr. Morrison, Richard's doctor, the one who made house calls now, who spoke to Richard privately in the hallway while Margaret sat in her room, listening to the murmur of voices she couldn't quite make out. Margaret looked around the restaurant. The other patrons seemed to be having a wonderful time. At table 3, a couple held hands across their plate. At table 5, a group of women laughed loudly, genuinely, the kind of laugh that came from real joy. At table 9, an elderly man smiled at his granddaughter with such tenderness that it made Margaret's chest hurt. She wondered if anyone here knew what it felt like to be invisible while surrounded by people. To be present but not really there. To be a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. That's when she noticed the waiter approach with their next course. He set the plates down with practiced grace and was about to leave when he paused, seeming to notice Margaret's trembling hands. For a moment, his eyes met hers with something that might have been concerning. Then Richard coughed slightly, and the waiter moved away. Margaret looked at her water glass, at her napkin, and then at the pristine white tablecloth. They had taken her bank accounts. Not officially, not in any way that would be illegal. But Richard had convinced her that it was too complicated to manage at her age. He and Catherine were listed as signatories now. They said it was for her protection, to make sure nothing happened to her money while she was, as they put it, not in a clear state of mind. She wasn't in an unclear state of mind. Her mind was perfectly clear, crystal clear, which was precisely the problem. She could see exactly what was happening. The weekly allowance they gave her was $200. $200 for a woman who had once donated $500,000 to her favorite charities in a single year. $200 for someone whose jewelry alone, jewelry she was now forbidden from wearing because it drew unwanted attention, was worth several $1,000,000. The medications had started 3 months ago. Dr. Morrison had prescribed them for her anxiety, for her mood, for her own good, Richard said. But they made her foggy. They made her docile. They made it harder to think about the documents Richard had asked her to sign. The power of attorney, the updated will, the one that left everything to Richard and Catherine, with just a small stipend for her nursing care. The lawyer she had wanted to call, her old friend David Rothstein, had been told by Richard that Margaret was confused about his services, that she had already changed attorneys. Richard had been so smooth about it, so reasonable. He had simply mentioned it at dinner one night, as though it were nothing, and she had been too medicated to argue properly. Margaret looked up from the tablecloth and met her son's eyes. He was watching her, always watching, making sure she was compliant, making sure she didn't cause any embarrassment, making sure she didn't try to leave. She couldn't leave. Richard had taken her keys. He said it was because her driving was becoming unsafe. Catherine had replaced her phone when the old one broke, and Margaret's new phone could only receive calls that came through their home line. They monitored her emails. They had been very careful, very smart about it all. They had covered every exit. The wine in her glass was a Chateau Margaux 1990. Margaret had owned a case of it once. She had sold it 6 months ago when she thought she might need money for a lawyer. Richard had been very upset when he found out. He had told her how foolish that was, how she couldn't be trusted to make financial decisions. Margaret's fingers trembled as she picked up her white linen napkin. She glanced up at Richard and Catherine. They were talking between themselves now, discussing some party they were planning. Her birthday party, they had said, though they hadn't actually asked her if she wanted one. They were planning to announce her will publicly at that party, making some grand gesture about family legacy and responsible succession. They had giggled about it in the hallway, not realizing she could hear them. She pulled out the lipstick from her purse. It was a deep red color, the same shade she had worn for 40 years. She had sneaked it back from the bathroom where Catherine had thrown it out, saying that bright colors made her look garish. That red lipstick had been under her mattress for 2 weeks. Margaret's hand shook as she uncapped it. She could feel Richard's attention shifting toward her, could feel the weight of his gaze starting to turn. She had maybe 5 seconds. She wrote the letters in a shaky but deliberate script across the white tablecloth. Each letter is precise despite her trembling hand. Each letter is a small act of rebellion. Each letter is a prayer. Help! What on earth are you doing? Catherine's voice cut through the soft murmur of the restaurant like a knife. Margaret's heart was hammering. She quickly capped the lipstick and shoved it back into her purse. "I'm sorry," she said, reaching for her napkin. "I thought there was something on the tablecloth. A smudge. I was trying to clean it." Richard's face had gone very still, very controlled. "Leave it," he said quietly. The waiter was already approaching, alerted by the unusual commotion at table 7. "There's been a small accident," Richard told him with a smooth smile. "Could you bring us a fresh tablecloth?" "Of course, sir." As the waiter moved to replace the tablecloth, Margaret felt her entire body deflate. She had failed. Her one desperate attempt, her moment of defiance, was being erased like it had never existed. In moments, there would be no evidence that she had ever cried for help at all. She looked down at her lap. She could feel Richard's anger radiating across the table like heat from a furnace. There would be consequences for this. There always were. Catherine would suddenly become very concerned about her mental state. Richard would call Dr. Morrison first thing in the morning. The medication dosage would probably be increased. There might be talk about a facility, a place where she could be properly cared for. The fresh tablecloth arrived, pristine and white, as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. For a brief moment, Margaret had tried to speak her truth. And even though it was being wiped away, even though it might not matter, she had done it. She just didn't know that someone had been watching. 3 tables over, at table 4, Marcus Sterling had noticed everything. Marcus was a man accustomed to reading situations. It was what had made him successful. At 58 years old, he had built a technology empire from nothing, transforming from a poor kid from Newark into a billionaire philanthropist. He had done this by paying attention to details that other people missed, by noticing the small tells in a business partner's voice that indicated they were about to lie, by watching how people moved through rooms, how they interacted with each other, what their body language revealed about the power dynamics at play. He had learned to read the world the way other people read books. And what he was reading at table 7 was telling him a story that made his blood run cold. The woman was in her 70s, beautiful in that timeless way that comes from a life well lived. There was intelligence in her eyes, despite the slight tremor in her hands. There was something else too, something that Marcus recognized because he had seen it before. He had seen it in the eyes of his mother years ago, before she had finally gathered the courage to leave his father. Fear, carefully hidden, but present. The way the woman held herself was wrong. She sat at the table as though she were taking up as little space as possible, as though she were trying not to exist. The man across from her, handsome in that polished way of old money, radiated control. He watched her with the kind of attention that wasn't affection. It was surveillance. Marcus had dated enough women to recognize the look in the younger woman's eyes. It was satisfying, the satisfaction of someone who had won something, or someone who was winning something. When the woman had written on the tablecloth, Marcus had seen it clearly. The letters were shaky, but they were intentional. They spelled help, and the man's response had been to erase it, to make it disappear, to act as though it had never happened. Marcus set down his wine glass very carefully. He was dining alone tonight, which was unusual for him. His assistant had canceled his date with a woman from Soho, a divorce attorney named Jennifer who was supposed to be his companion for the evening. He had come to Lawrence anyway. He liked solitude. He liked sitting at table 4, which was his regular table, where he could watch the room and think about his next venture. Now he was watching something that he could not unsee. The couple at table 7 was trying to act as though nothing unusual had happened. The woman looked mortified, diminished. The man was being cold in that particular way that suggested punishment was coming. The younger woman was picking at her food with satisfied little movements. Marcus knew the law. As a billionaire who donated millions to legal causes and social justice initiatives, he was intimately familiar with what constituted elder abuse. What he was seeing might be it, or it might be nothing. It might be a family dynamic that, while uncomfortable, was ultimately private. Or it might be someone literally asking for help. The problem was that Marcus couldn't know for certain. And the question that now burned in his mind was simple but devastating. What was his responsibility in this moment? He had built his fortune on calculated risks, on the willingness to move when others hesitated. But this wasn't a business deal. This was a person's life. And interfering could make things worse. It often did. He watched as the meal continued. The woman barely ate anything. The man checked his phone repeatedly, his attention only shifting back to the woman to make sure she was still there, still under control. The younger woman talked about a gala they were planning, about the importance of image, about what people would think. Everything in Marcus's body was screaming at him to do something. But what? He finished his wine. He ordered the chocolate soufflé that Lawrence was famous for. He acted like a normal diner at a luxury restaurant. But his mind was working in the background, analyzing, considering, planning. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus watched the couple prepare to leave. The man stood first and helped the younger woman with her chair, a gesture that looked almost choreographed in its courtesy. Then he turned to the older woman and offered his arm. She took it, but there was something broken in the way she did it. That's when Marcus made his decision. He stood as they passed his table and caught the older woman's eye. Just for a moment. Just long enough to give her a nod. The kind of nod that said, "I see you. I believe you. You are not invisible." Her eyes widened slightly. Her breath seemed to catch. And then the man was pulling her away, his hand suddenly very firm on her arm, and they were gone. Marcus sat back down and pulled out his phone. He called his head of security. "I need you to do something for me." Discreetly. "There was a couple that just left Lawrence. I need you to follow them. Get their license plate. Find out where they live. I need a full profile. Names, addresses, financial records if you can get them. And I need it by tomorrow morning." "Is there a problem, Mr. Sterling?" his security chief asked. "Maybe," Marcus said, looking at the white tablecloth where the red letters had been. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to find out." He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair. The pianist was still playing. The restaurant was still beautiful. The other diners were still enjoying their meals, unaware of the small drama that had just unfolded. But everything had changed. The woman at table 7 had reached out in the only way she could. And Marcus Sterling had seen her. Now the real question was, what would he do with what he knew? The answer to that question would reshape all of their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. Dear friends, if you've been enjoying this story so far, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment below. We'd love to hear what you think might happen next. Does Marcus have the right to interfere, or should he stay out of it? Let us know your thoughts. The next morning, Marcus arrived at his office on the 42nd floor of a gleaming tower in Midtown with one thing on his mind: the woman from table 7. His security chief, David Chun, was waiting for him with a folder. Marcus took it without a word and opened it as he settled into his office chair. The view behind him showed the entire city stretched out like a circuit board, all power and possibility. The first page contained photographs. The man's name was Richard Chun, no relation to David. Age 51. He worked in corporate law at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms. The woman was Catherine Ashford, age 49, the daughter of a real estate magnate. They lived in a penthouse in the Upper East Side, one of the most expensive addresses in the city. But it was the third photograph that made Marcus's breath catch. It was the older woman. Her name was Margaret Chun, born 1951, widowed in 2018. Her husband had been Robert Chun, a venture capitalist who had amassed a substantial fortune over his lifetime. Their son was Richard Chin. So the woman at table 7 was not just anyone. She was a widow of significant means. Or she had been. Marcus read further. Margaret's late husband's will had been substantial, but the bulk of his estate had been left to Richard with the understanding that he would care for his mother. Margaret had her own assets as well, inherited money from her family investment portfolio's property. Then Marcus saw the dates. 6 months ago, Margaret had transferred power of attorney to Richard. 3 months ago, she changed her will. 4 weeks ago, she had closed several of her investment accounts, transferring the funds to accounts controlled by Richard and Catherine. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Marcus closed the folder and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, Margaret Chun was probably having breakfast in that penthouse. She was probably taking medication that wasn't helping her. She was probably contemplating how she could escape a trap that had been carefully constructed around her with the legal precision of someone who knew the law very well indeed. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of an old friend. Sarah Martinez had been one of his first investors when he was starting out. She had built a law practice that specialized in elder abuse and financial exploitation. She was one of the smartest people he knew. "Marcus, this is a surprise," she answered. "Please tell me you're not calling to try to convince me to represent you in one of your business deals again." "I'm calling because I need your advice on something off the record," he said. "And I might need your help with a case. A personal one." An hour later, Sarah was in his office, reading the file. Her expression grew darker with each page. "This is textbook exploitation," she said finally. "The power of attorney, the will changes, the isolation, the medication increases. Everything points to a coordinated effort to transfer her assets while keeping her docile and compliant. Richard's a smart lawyer, which makes him especially dangerous. He knows exactly how to stay on the right side of the law while doing everything wrong." "Can it be proven?" Marcus asked. "Maybe, if we can find evidence. If Margaret is willing to testify. If we can get her evaluated by an independent doctor. But here's the problem. She's not going to come forward on her own. She's frightened. She's been made dependent. She's probably doubting her own judgment at this point. That's what happens when someone exerts this kind of control." Marcus nodded. He had suspected as much. "So what do we do?" Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Legally, we have very limited options without Margaret's consent. She's an adult, not under guardianship, so she has the right to make her own decisions, even bad ones. Even if those decisions are being coerced." "That's not acceptable," Marcus said flatly. "I know," Sarah said. "But that's the reality of elder abuse cases. The perpetrators are usually family members, which makes it complicated. The victims are often too afraid or too confused to seek help. The evidence is often circumstantial. And the system is not designed to intervene until someone is clearly incompetent or there's been a crime." Marcus stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the city, thinking about power, about responsibility, about the woman whose eyes had met him for just a moment, communicating a desperate need that his interference had acknowledged but not yet fulfilled. "There has to be another way," he said quietly. "Maybe," Sarah said, "but it's going to require Margaret to be willing to help herself. She has to want to get out. And right now, based on what you've told me, she doesn't believe she can." That was the heart of it, wasn't it? It wasn't really about the law or the evidence or the money. It was about Margaret's belief in her own ability to change her circumstances. It was about helping her see that escape was possible. Marcus turned back to Sarah. "I saw her at a restaurant last night. She wrote help on the tablecloth. Then her son made it disappear. She was crying out, and I was the only one who heard her. Sarah's expression softened. That's a call for help. But it's also a moment of desperation. It doesn't mean she's ready to be saved. And sometimes, if we try to save someone before they're ready, we can make things worse. So I do nothing? I didn't say that, Sarah said. But whatever you do, you need to be careful. It needs to be strategic. And most importantly, it needs to put Margaret's agency at the center. We can't save her. She has to save herself. But we can make sure she knows that salvation is possible. Marcus thought about this as Sarah left his office an hour later with instructions to research the case further and develop a strategy. He had resources at his disposal that most people didn't have. Money, power, connections. But as Sarah had pointed out, none of those things mattered if Margaret didn't want to be helped. He needed to reach her. He needed to find a way to communicate with her, to let her know that her cry for help had been heard, that she wasn't alone, that there was a way out. And he needed to do it without alerting Richard that he was trying. That evening, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He went back to Lawrence. He arrived just before 8 and was escorted to table 4. He ordered wine and looked over the menu, all while his eyes scanned the room. He waited for an hour and a half. He was beginning to think that the Chens might not come back tonight when he saw them enter. Richard and Catherine, but this time they brought Margaret. Margaret looked smaller somehow, more diminished than she had the night before. She was wearing a gray dress that did nothing to flatter her complexion. Her hair looked like it hadn't been properly styled. Her lips, which should have been the signature red that Marcus had glimpsed in the lipstick she had used, were pale and colorless. They were seated at table 7 again. Marcus watched as they went through the motions of dinner. Richard was particularly attentive to Margaret tonight, which somehow made it worse. He was performing care. He was demonstrating to the world that he was a good son. It was all calculated, all part of the narrative he was constructing. When the appetizers came, Marcus made his move. He rose from his chair and walked directly to their table. Richard looked up with the kind of polite surprise that wealthy men of a certain age affect when approached by another wealthy man. "Excuse me," Marcus said smoothly. "I apologize for the interruption, but I couldn't help noticing that your mother has the same emerald brooch that my mother wore for 40 years. It's quite distinctive." He was looking at Margaret as he spoke, directly at her with complete focus. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. The brooch he was referring to was not visible. She wasn't wearing any jewelry. But the implication was clear. He saw her. He noticed her. He recognized something in her that deserved recognition. Richard's smile tightened very slightly. "How interesting. My mother has excellent taste in jewelry." "I'm sure she does," Marcus said, and this time he looked directly at Richard. "My mother's taste was impeccable. She was a remarkable woman. Strong. Intelligent. Not the type to let anyone push her around, if you know what I mean." A flicker of something crossed Richard's face. Understanding, perhaps. A recognition that he was being called out, even if the call was coded in polite language. "I'm sure that's true," Richard said, his voice losing a bit of its warmth. "We're about to eat, so if you'll excuse us." "Of course," Marcus said. "I just wanted to say, Margaret, is it? That if you ever need anything at all, you should reach out. I leave my card with all the good restaurants in the city. I have some very good friends who are lawyers. Very good friends who help people navigate difficult situations. My card is in the small black wallet I'm about to leave on the table. You might want to keep it." He produced a black leather wallet from his jacket pocket and placed it on the white tablecloth between Margaret and Catherine. "Enjoy your dinner," Marcus said, and then he walked back to his table. He didn't look back. He knew what had just happened. He had made direct contact with Margaret. He had communicated that he knew what was happening, and he had offered her a lifeline, encoded in language that Richard might not fully understand but that Margaret would. Margaret would know that there was someone who could help, someone who had the resources and the will to do so, someone who believed her. What she would do with that knowledge remained to be seen. 5 days passed. No one called. No one reached out. Marcus continued his normal routine. He went to work, reviewed his technology portfolio, attended meetings about his various philanthropic initiatives. But he thought about Margaret constantly. He wondered what was happening in that penthouse. Whether Richard had discovered the wallet. Whether Margaret had managed to open it. Whether she was considering calling. On the 6th day, his assistant told him there was someone here to see him. A woman named Margaret Chin. She didn't have an appointment, but she had been very insistent. Marcus's heart rate accelerated, but he kept his expression neutral. "Send her in," he said. Margaret entered his office moving carefully, as though her body hurt. She was wearing the same gray dress from the restaurant. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear and intelligent and filled with desperate hope. "I'm sorry to impose," she said quietly, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "Please." Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." She did, perching on the edge of the chair as though she might need to flee at any moment. "How did you get here?" Marcus asked. "I told them I had a doctor's appointment," Margaret said. "I took a car service. I said I would text them when I was ready to be picked up. I have maybe 2 hours." "That's not much time," Marcus said. "It's all I could manage," Margaret said, and now her voice cracked slightly. "I need to know if what you said was real, if you really meant it, if there really is a way out." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Margaret, what you wrote on the tablecloth, help. I saw it. I believed it. And yes, there is a way out. But I need you to understand something very important. I can provide resources, legal help, connections. But I cannot get you out. Only you can do that. You have to be willing to leave. Do you understand?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Tell me everything," Marcus said. "Tell me exactly what's happening." And Margaret did. For over an hour, she detailed the carefully constructed trap that had been set around her. She talked about how it had started innocently enough, with Richard insisting she move in with them for her own safety. How the access to her accounts had been portrayed as convenience. How the power of attorney had been framed as necessary for emergencies. How the medication had been prescribed for anxiety that she had never really felt. She talked about the isolation. How her friends had been discouraged from visiting. How her phone had been replaced. How her old life had been systematically dismantled. "The worst part," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "is that I can't prove any of it, not in a way that matters legally. The power of attorney was signed freely, as far as anyone can tell. The will was signed by me with witnesses present. The medication was prescribed by a licensed physician. Everything looks legitimate. But it's not," Marcus said quietly. "It's exploitation, and we're going to prove it." "How?" Margaret asked. "He's a lawyer. He's been careful. He's been smart." "He has been careful," Marcus agreed. "But everyone makes mistakes. And more importantly, we have something he doesn't have: time. We're not going to rush this. We're going to build an undeniable case. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "I'm going to connect you with a lawyer named Sarah Martinez. She specializes in elder abuse cases. You're going to see her in secret. We're going to document everything: your current mental state, your capacity to make decisions, the changes in your medications, the financial transfers. We're going to get you a second medical opinion from a doctor Richard doesn't control." He turned back to face her. "I'm going to provide safe housing, somewhere Richard can't reach you. And we're going to wait. We're going to give Richard enough rope to hang himself. Because men like Richard always go too far eventually. They always push just a little bit more. And that's when we strike." "What if he finds out before then?" Margaret asked. "What if he realizes what we're doing?" "Then we move faster," Marcus said. "But we're going to be careful. We're going to make sure you're safe every step of the way." Margaret was crying openly now, but she was nodding. "I'm frightened," she admitted. "I know that sounds foolish. He's my son. But there's something in his eyes sometimes that—" "It's not foolish," Marcus said gently. "You have every right to be frightened, and you have every right to protect yourself. That's not a weakness. That's wisdom." Over the next hour, Marcus laid out a plan. He provided Margaret with a burner phone. He gave her the address of a safe apartment that one of his companies maintained for his employees. He connected her with Sarah Martinez, who would meet her the following day. "You're going back to the penthouse," Marcus said. "You're going to act completely normal. You're going to take your medication. You're going to smile and nod and make Richard believe that nothing has changed. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded. "I've been doing it for 6 months. I can continue for as long as necessary." "Good," Marcus said, "because that's the only way this works. We have to be patient. We have to be smart. And we have to be absolutely certain that we have an ironclad case before we make a move." When Margaret left his office 2 hours and 30 minutes after she had arrived, she looked different. She was still frightened, but there was something else in her eyes now, something that looked like hope. Marcus watched her go, and then he picked up his phone and called Sarah. "She's in," he said. "Let's begin." The weeks that followed were a careful ballet of deception and documentation. Margaret returned to the penthouse and resumed her role as the diminished mother. She took her medications without complaint. She ate the meals Catherine prepared. She smiled when Richard asked if she was feeling better. She was a perfect daughter-in-law, a model of compliance. But in secret, she was fighting back. 3 times a week, during her doctor's appointments, Margaret met with Sarah Martinez in a small office downtown. They documented everything: her clear thinking, her ability to make coherent arguments about her own situation, the changes in her medications and their effects. Sarah brought in an independent physician, Dr. James Patterson, who evaluated Margaret thoroughly and found her to be in complete command of her faculties. Sarah also began the process of gathering evidence about Richard's actions. She obtained copies of the financial records showing the transfers. She documented the changes to the will. She gathered testimony from Margaret's friends about how she had been isolated. Meanwhile, Marcus's security team was watching Richard. They documented his visits to banks, to lawyers, to investment firms. They gathered evidence of his spending habits, which had increased dramatically since gaining control of Margaret's assets. They noted that he had paid off significant personal debts. They observed that he and Catherine were making plans to buy a second home in the Hamptons. The picture that emerged was damning. A man who had systematically stolen from his own mother, who had drugged her into compliance, who had constructed an elaborate legal framework to make his theft appear legitimate. But they still needed one more thing. They needed Margaret to be willing to testify, to be willing to accuse her own son publicly, to be willing to face the social consequences of that accusation. This was the hardest part. Margaret knew what it would mean. There would be a trial. There would be publicity. Richard's law firm would likely drop him. Catherine would probably divorce him to protect her own assets. Margaret's reputation in society would be complicated by the fact that it would appear she was accusing her own child of serious crimes. It would cost her greatly even if they won. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked her one evening, 2 months into their preparation. "No," Margaret said honestly, "but I know I have to, because if I don't, he'll keep doing this, possibly to someone else. And I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I had a chance to stop him and I didn't." Sarah nodded. "That's a good answer. That's the answer of someone who understands what they're fighting for." On a Tuesday morning in early autumn, Margaret called Richard from the penthouse and told him that she wasn't feeling well. She was going to lie down. She asked him to ask Catherine to check on her in an hour. Then she walked out of the penthouse with a small bag she had been quietly packing for weeks. She left her ring on the nightstand. She left her watch on the dresser. She left everything he had given her or convinced her she couldn't live without. She took only what she had truly owned from the beginning. Her wedding ring from Robert. A photograph of her children when they were young and still loved her. Her emerald brooch, which she had retrieved from where Catherine had hidden it. Marcus's driver was waiting on the street below. 2 hours later, when Catherine checked on Margaret and found the empty room, she called Richard in a panic. Richard immediately called the police and reported his mother missing. But before the police could even begin their search, Sarah Martinez walked into the district attorney's office with Margaret at her side, and they filed charges of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud. What happened over the next 6 months would be extensively covered in the media. Richard's law firm immediately suspended him. The Bar Association initiated disciplinary proceedings. Margaret's bank accounts were frozen pending the outcome of the case, but Marcus quietly arranged funding for her legal defense and her living expenses. Richard hired one of the best lawyers in the state, a woman who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. The case became a battle between two legal titans, fought in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. The trial was brutal. Richard's attorney argued that everything had been done for Margaret's protection, that the medication was necessary for her anxiety, that the financial transfers had been made at her request, that the power of attorney was standard for aging parents. But Sarah and her team had done their homework too well. They presented medical testimony that Margaret was never anxious, that her medications had been increased without medical justification. They presented bank records that showed Richard had been making personal expenditures from Margaret's accounts. They presented testimony from Margaret's friends about her sudden isolation. And they presented Margaret herself. She took the stand and told the truth. She described the careful dismantling of her autonomy. She talked about writing help on the tablecloth. She talked about the fear that had made her compliant. She talked about how much it hurt to have her own child betray her trust. When Richard's attorney tried to suggest that she was confused, that she was the one being manipulated now by lawyers and this mysterious businessman who had taken an interest in her case, Margaret's response was quiet but devastating. "My memory is perfect," she said. "I remember every moment of the last 6 months. I remember every feeling of helplessness. I remember every time my son looked at me like I was an asset rather than a person. And I especially remember the moment I wrote help on that tablecloth. I remember it because it was the moment I realized that I had to fight back, no matter what it cost me. Because if I didn't, he would take everything. My money, my independence, my life. He had already taken so much. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Richard's face went absolutely blank. Catherine, who had left him by then, watched with an expression that was half satisfaction and half grief, knowing that her comfortable life was about to change considerably. The sentence was substantial. 7 years in prison, a hefty fine, and mandatory restitution to Margaret of every penny that had been taken. Justice, it turned out, did exist. It just required someone to care enough to fight for it. 1 year after the trial, Margaret sat in a restaurant that she had chosen herself. It was not as fancy as Lawrence, but it was elegant in its own way, with warm lighting and real flowers on the tables. She was having dinner with Marcus Sterling and Sarah Martinez. "I wanted to thank you both," Margaret said, raising her glass of wine, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing me when I didn't believe in myself, for fighting for me." "You fought for yourself," Sarah said. "We just provided the tools. And the financial support," Marcus added with a slight smile. "Don't minimize that part. I'm a businessman. I like to take credit for my investments." Margaret laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from genuine joy. "You were an investment that paid off remarkably well. How are you doing?" Marcus asked. "Really?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I'm doing well," she said finally. "Grief-stricken about Richard. Still processing what my son became. But whole. That's the most important thing. I feel like a whole person again. Like I own my own life." "You do," Sarah said. "I'm speaking at a conference next month," Margaret continued, "about elder abuse, about how it happens quietly, legally, in ways that the system isn't equipped to stop. I want to help other people see the signs before it's too late. I want to make sure no one else has to write help on a tablecloth because they've run out of other options." Marcus raised his glass. "To Margaret Chen, who is far stronger than she knows." They clinked glasses, and for a moment, there was the simple pleasure of 3 people who had fought something dark together and won. Later that evening, after Marcus and Sarah had left, Margaret sat alone at her table for a while longer, lingering over her dessert and coffee. She looked around the restaurant and noticed an elderly man dining with his granddaughter. She noticed a couple holding hands across their plates. She noticed a woman sitting alone, much like herself, but with a smile on her face that suggested contentment rather than fear. The world was still full of beauty and danger. The world was still complex and difficult and sometimes cruel. But Margaret had learned something essential over the past year. She had a voice, and the world would listen if she was brave enough to use it. She thought about that moment at Lawrence, when she had picked up her lipstick and written help across the tablecloth. She had thought at that moment that no one would see it, that she was alone, that there was no way out. She had been wrong. There was always a way out. Sometimes it required someone like Marcus to see you. Sometimes it requires someone like Sarah to fight for you. But most of all, it required you to be willing to see yourself, to recognize your own worth, to believe that you deserved better. Margaret paid her bill and stood to leave. As she walked out of the restaurant into the cool autumn evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. She had her life back, and she intended to make the most of every remaining moment of it. For those who have followed this incredible journey with us, thank you for spending your time with Margaret's story. We hope you found it meaningful. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. We'll see you next time. The months following Margaret's recovery were marked by a quiet transformation. Her story, though painful, had become a catalyst for change. She had donated significantly to Sarah's elder abuse prevention organization. She had worked with Marcus on establishing a foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable populations from financial exploitation. But the most profound changes were personal. Margaret had reconnected with old friends who had been shut out during her darkest days. They had welcomed her back with open arms, though the explanations had been complicated and sometimes uncomfortable. Some of them had noticed something was wrong but hadn't known how to intervene. They carried guilt about that. Margaret spent time reassuring them that she had not expected them to fight her battles for her. She had also visited her daughter, Lisa, who lived in California. Lisa had broken ties with Richard years ago over a business dispute, but she hadn't known the full extent of what he had done to their mother. When Margaret told her, Lisa had wept. They had spent a week together, rebuilding the relationship that had fractured years before. By the end of the visit, Lisa had promised to bring her family to New York for Christmas. Margaret had taken up photography again, something she had abandoned decades ago when Robert's career had become all-consuming. She had purchased a high-quality camera and was beginning to explore the city through a new lens. Several of her photographs had been accepted for a small gallery show. There was talk of a book deal about her journey. Most surprisingly, Margaret had become a consultant for law enforcement and attorneys who dealt with elder abuse cases. Her perspective as someone who had lived through it was invaluable. She helped people recognize the signs. She taught them how to approach victims carefully, with compassion and respect for their agency. She had already influenced the prosecution of 3 other cases similar to her own. Her life, which had seemed so small and constrained just a year and a half ago, had expanded in ways she could never have imagined. Richard's appeal had been denied. He was serving his sentence at a minimum security facility upstate. Margaret had not visited him, and she had no plans to. She had forgiven him in the sense that she no longer carried the weight of anger, but forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. Her son had made choices, and those choices had consequences. She had learned to live with the grief of that. Catherine had remarried. She had sold the penthouse and moved to Connecticut with her new husband, a venture capitalist who, from all accounts, treated her well. She had sent Margaret a brief letter of apology through her attorney, acknowledging her role in the exploitation and expressing regret. Margaret had responded with a short note stating that she accepted the apology but did not wish to maintain contact. It was a clean boundary, and it gave both of them permission to move forward. As for Marcus, he had become something like a friend. Not a close friend, the circumstances of their meeting would always create a certain distance, but a genuine friend nonetheless. He had introduced Margaret to his circle of philanthropists and activists. She found herself at dinner parties with people who were actively working to change the world. She was asked for her perspective. Her voice mattered. One evening, about 18 months after the trial, Marcus invited Margaret to dinner at Lawrence. "I have to admit," Margaret said as they were seated at table 4, "I was hesitant about coming back here." "I know," Marcus said, "but I think it's important that you reclaim this place, that you don't let this restaurant be a place of fear for you, that you transform it from a place where you cried for help into a place where you celebrate your freedom." Margaret looked around the restaurant. It looked exactly as it had before, of course, but it felt different now. The power it had held over her had diminished. "You're right," she said. "I needed this." As they studied the menu, the sommelier approached. "Ms. Chun," he said, with a warmth that suggested he remembered her. "We have something special for you this evening." He produced a bottle of wine. It was a Chateau Margaux 1990. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she saw it. "I remembered you mentioning that your late husband had owned a case of this," Marcus said. I thought it might be nice to share a glass with you in his memory." Margaret couldn't speak for a moment. She looked at the bottle, at Marcus, and felt tears beginning to form. "You're a good man," she said finally. "I wish I had encountered you under different circumstances." "Perhaps," Marcus said, "but then I might never have understood the importance of paying attention. I might never have learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply see another person. Really see them. Not their wealth or their status, but their humanity." The evening unfolded beautifully. The wine was exquisite, tasting of careful aging and the passage of time. The food was extraordinary. But more than anything, the conversation was rich and meaningful. They talked about loss, about resilience, about the ways that tragedy can become transformation if we're willing to do the hard work of healing. As dessert was served, Margaret looked directly at Marcus. "That night at the restaurant," she said, "when you walked up to our table and mentioned the brooch, did you really see anything? Or were you just giving me a signal?" Marcus smiled. "I saw you," he said simply. "I saw a woman who was invisible, even though she was sitting right there. I saw someone who was worth saving, even if she didn't yet believe it herself. And I saw a moment where I had a choice. I could look away, or I could look directly at you and acknowledge your humanity. I couldn't not do it. It wasn't a choice, really. It was just basic human decency." Margaret nodded. "That basic human decency changed my life." "Your willingness to change your life saved it," Marcus corrected gently. Later, as they waited for their coats, Margaret found herself standing in the entrance to Lawrence looking back into the restaurant. She could almost see herself at the table 7 years ago, writing those desperate letters with trembling hands. That Margaret had felt like she was at the end of all possibilities. That Margaret had believed she was powerless. But Margaret had been wrong. The Margaret who stood at the entrance now was different. She had reclaimed her autonomy. She had rebuilt her life. She had found a voice and was using it to help others. She was planning a future. She was whole. "Thank you for making me come back here," she said to Marcus as they stepped out into the night. "Thank you for reminding me why it matters," he replied. They parted ways at the curb, and Margaret rode home through the streets of Manhattan feeling more at peace than she had in longer than she could remember. She thought about the woman in the black dress who had called for help across the tablecloth, and she realized that the woman hadn't really disappeared. She had transformed. She had become stronger. She had become someone who could help others like her. In her apartment that night, Margaret looked through photographs. Photos of her old life with Robert. Photos of her children when they were young and unbroken. Photos she had recently taken of the city through her new lens. All of them told a story. The story of a life lived. The story of joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, love and loss. The story of a woman who had been pushed down but had found the strength to stand again. She pulled out the one photograph that meant more to her than any other. It was the photo from her gallery show opening, taken by one of her friends. In it, Margaret stood in front of one of her photographs, smiling with genuine joy. In the background, blurred but present, were the people who had helped save her. Marcus, Sarah, her daughter Lisa, old friends whose names she had thought she had lost. She was not alone. She had never been truly alone, though it had felt that way at the time. There was a card with her name written in elegant script. It was from someone she had spoken to at the gallery opening, a woman who had attended one of Margaret's talks about elder abuse. The woman had written, "Your story gave me courage to stand up for my own mother. Thank you for your bravery." Margaret felt tears form again, but these were different tears. These were tears of purpose, of meaning, of the knowledge that suffering transformed into wisdom could change other lives. She placed the photograph on her nightstand, in the place of honor where Robert's picture had always stood. It wasn't a replacement. It was an expansion. It was a recognition that her life had grown and changed and become something new. She thought of the question that Marcus had asked her, "Are you sure you want to do this?" She had said no, but yes. No, she wasn't sure. Yes, she had to do it anyway. That was the definition of courage she had learned. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. Margaret turned off her light and lay in the darkness, feeling the weight of her own life settling around her like a familiar blanket. She had survived something that had nearly destroyed her. She had found strength she didn't know she possessed. She had learned that help could come from unexpected places, that goodness still existed in the world, that it was possible to rebuild. As sleep began to take her, she thought about that moment at Lawrence when she had written help on the tablecloth. At that moment, she had believed no one would see it, that her cry would be lost, that she was truly alone. She had been wrong about all of it. Someone had seen her, and that had changed everything. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of purpose that had become familiar but was still gratifying. She had a breakfast meeting with a young woman who was considering coming forward about abuse she had suffered. She had a call with Sarah about an upcoming case. She had an afternoon of photography planned in Washington Square Park. Her life was full, rich, meaningful. She showered, dressed, and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw a woman of 74 years old. Yes, but she saw more than that. She saw resilience, intelligence, strength. She saw someone worth saving, and she smiled. Thank you for joining us on Margaret's journey from invisible victim to empowered survivor. We hope her story has moved you, perhaps reminded you of the importance of seeing those around us who might be suffering in silence. Please comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of human courage and transformation. We'll see you next time.